for. I wouldn't say it's the only requirement, and we've had a debate about this in previous shows as well, with different people, all walks of life, doing our broadcast. Not being able to speak Tagalog or Filipino, broadly speaking, does not preclude you from being a Filipino, and no one should ever make you feel that way. But I've heard so many stories, and I've experienced it myself, where if you're not fluent in Filipino, there are certainly Filipinos out there that will say you're not Filipino. So,
a Kangaroo Fern production.
Welcome
to Guerrilla Podcast, Fresh Eyes.
The beat that makes you feel good.
A weekly podcast that features interviews with social change leaders or individuals that aims to bring audiences good stories to motivate their own social impact efforts. Now, here's your host.
Hello, Humanista. Welcome to another episode of Guerrilla Podcast, Fresh Eyes. Hey, welcome to 2020, and this is our second or season 2, episode 1 of the Guerrilla Podcast. Thank you so much to all our sponsor. If you want to sponsor this podcast, please visit our patreon.com/kangaroofirm, or you can email us at info@kangaroofirm.com. On our first episode, season 2 in 2020, we're talking about broadcasting. We're talking about how is the Filipino culture diversify in Australia. So what's the Filipino community doing to integrate in Australian society? For this episode, we are very lucky that our guest for today is a Filipino born, and he is the chairman of 5 EVI 103.1 FM. It's a multicultural radio station in South Australia and Adelaide, and he also the vice president of National Ethnic Multicultural Broadcasting Council. Please welcome Juan Paolo Legaspi. Thank you so much. How are you today?
yeah, good. Thanks for having me on your podcast. Much appreciated, Miko.
Thank you so much. So, before anything else, tell me about yourself.
Well, I was born in Manila, but I grew up mostly in Australia. So I was roughly about 2 years. When I was 2 years old, I moved to Melbourne, Sydney, Melbourne, then Adelaide. And that was just with me. I was an only child with my two parents. They came here almost post-Marcos, at the end of the Marcos era, and grew up here, basically. But we always tried, when I was growing up, I would always go back to the Philippines every year for Christmas, stay there for at least 1 month, even 2 months at a time, to spend time with my family. So I've really tried to stay connected with my roots as much as possible.
How do you involve on 5 EVI?
Well, that was through my mum. So she dragged me into it. So I've been broadcasting as a broadcaster on the radio for 10 years now.
Oh, okay.
But before that, I would help research the news articles for Mom, and she would help translate them and get them prepared for a program that was on Friday nights, which was for Dr. Wanta. And that was even when you use text-based browsers to research the news. So that was an interesting time. And that was when news was limited, really, about the Philippines. If you were a migrant coming to Australia, there was very limited news about what was happening in the Philippines. Obviously, things have changed now. But back then, it was quite important.
So you did. So you're saying that you are not, because of your mom, you are in line in the broadcasting?
That's what got me into it.
Get into it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the perfect timing, I think, because I started researching the news when I was going through late primary school, early high school. And I thought that was a great way of kind of getting in touch with my culture and my roots, especially going through those formative years, trying to, when you're going through your teenage years, you're trying to explore who you are and what you're all about. And I felt that really kept me grounded as a person and as a cultural identity about who I am. But that's how it all started. And then when I went through uni and I graduated from uni, I really saw the advantages of really honing in my creative skills And it helps practice many things, not only just about how you talk, public speaking talk, but it also helps you formulate your thoughts, keep it short and concise as much as possible. Interview techniques, production skills, all that kind of stuff kind of blended in. And so I started enjoying the administrative side of things a bit more as well, and the production side.
Do you agree that kids nowadays need to learn Tagalog as part of their culture?
I think it's helpful to learn about the language. In an increasingly globalized world, and everyone's interconnected, I think people kind of take that for advantage in the sense that they take that for granted. But the real work and the real rub is learning more about other cultures deeply. It's not good enough just to simply say, I can connect with someone on Facebook and we live in a globalized society. You got to really explore the culture, explore the language. There's even subtle differences between Filipino culture and Filipino-Australian culture versus Filipino-American culture. There's all these sub-genres underneath it as well. So it's important to really understand that and how your own experiences form who you are as a person, because everyone has their own journey about where they are as a person. And so learning the language is helpful. I wouldn't say it's the only requirement. And we've had a debate about this in previous shows as well, with different people, all walks of life, doing our broadcast. Not being able to speak Tagalog or Filipino, broadly speaking, does not preclude you from being a Filipino, and no one should ever make you feel that way. But I've heard so many stories, and I've experienced it myself, where if you're not fluent in Filipino, there are certainly Filipinos out there that will say you're not Filipino. So I'll make that slight distinction there.
That's a great story. So most of the Filipino are saying some of them can still understand the Tagalog, but they cannot speak on that. Is that because of that? Is the Radyo Filipino born because of that, to communicate with the Filipino community in Adelaide and South Australia as well?
Yeah, it was originally born from isolation, in a sense. You know, it was that constant wave of, I guess in Adelaide and Australia generally, Filipinos didn't come in a wave. Like with the Vietnamese migration, it mostly predominantly came from the Vietnam War. Filipinos have just consistently been coming to Australia over a period of time. But during the 80s and early 90s, it came from a place, Radyo Filipino came from a place of providing information from the Philippines into Adelaide. It's now evolved into a blended mix. You know, we still talk about what's going on in the Philippines, but we also talk about Filipino Adelaidean events as well. And we've got our own kind of subculture as well. So it's kind of evolved into our own local, hyper-local events and mixing it with Filipino life as well.
So the Radyo Filipino, so that you have 2 programs. So can you tell us about this program?
3 programs.
3, sorry.
So we've got a 1-hour program on Thursday afternoons. That's called Halo Halo Special. And then we've got a morning program from 8:30 to 9 a.m., a 30-minute program. And that's just a general mixed interest kind of show, just updates, light music and entertainment. Friday nights from 9 to 9:30, previously up to a year and a half ago, was called Radyo. And that was hosted by Dr. Wanta, who was one of the co-founders of Radyo Filipino. That was more like older tunes, croon tunes, for a particular older demographic. Since then, I've established Barkada Radio, and that's more for a younger audience, but also people that are not necessarily born in the Philippines, but maybe born here, but are interested in Filipino culture as well. So that's the 3 in total.
So the Barkada is like catered to young Filipinos living in Australia?
Yep.
So what is the main objective of that Barkada, the program itself?
It's meant to be making Filipino culture accessible. So we make a distinction with the rest of the other 2 programs in that Barkada is primarily English-speaking language program. And that comes from a place that there's a lot of second and third generation migrants, Filipino migrants that are now living in Adelaide and Australia. And, it's broadcast online, so around the world, that are interested in Filipino culture but don't necessarily speak the language. And we're trying to make it as inclusive as possible, and being Filipino as broad as possible. And I guess what we're trying to say is we're trying to preserve the culture, and yes, we're trying to preserve the language and our interest in music, but first of all, get them interested, and being Filipino is quite interesting.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you're notified when a new episode is posted in Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or via RSS. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, rate and review this podcast and share it with your friends. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and if you want to know more, check out kangaroofern.com.